You are listening to audio from Citizens Church Elmira. You can find more resources and learn more about our church at citizenselmira.ca.
Well, good morning, and I always feel pretty much at home here because of all the people that I know, although there are people I don't know here too. I've been asked to speak on Genesis chapter 29 to 31, and there's a bit of a theme here. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you. And we're going to see quite a few examples of that as we walk through this. And I've kind of titled this whole thing, well, it's not really a title, it's more of a description, a complete lack of imagination here. Jacob's 20 years in Haran, and applying a little bit of thought to this, there are things to learn in this section we're looking at today. Things for us to think about here in the 21st century. This occurred almost 4,000 years ago now, 2000 BC, and here we are in 2026. But yet you're going to see how God works despite all the stuff that's going on. So let's look at chapter 29 first of all. Jacob starts his family is the big title here, and I think there's no way we can cover everything in these three chapters. The more I dived into this, excuse the grammar, the more I dove into this, grammar was never my strong point in school. The more I saw, there's a lot of fascinating stuff in here. And Patty and I had some good discussions this week, especially yesterday, on some of the historical details. We won't be able to look at it all, but let's look at a few things. And this is kind of like the backstory here. It leads us into the 20 years in Haran. So it's roughly, I went up, what did I do? I can't remember, ChatGPT or something. How far is it from Beersheba to Haran, ancient Haran? And it's about 900 kilometers. That's about a 30-day trip, judging from a trip I went with my boys for about a week with a 45-pound pack on my back. We crossed the Great Divide, climbed over countless fallen trees over the path, and we did about 30-some kilometers that day. And I was done. I was done by that day, but I figured he's younger than I was. I was 61 when I did that. And so he could probably cover 30 days. He's not going over any mountain passes. Well, I don't know about that. But by mid-afternoon on the final day, he arrives in Haran, and he sees Rachel. Well, actually, what he sees is this well, and there's 3 flocks of sheep around this well, and they're shepherds, and it's still in the afternoon. It's high day. What's going on here? And he says, well, the guys say, well, it's a big rock on here. We got to get all together first. We take the rock off, and everybody can water their flocks. Just as they're saying that, along comes Rachel, who at that point is a very young woman, maybe even a teenager still, don't know for sure. And when he sees Rachel, and when he sees the flock of his mother's brother's Laban, he then, looks like to me, he gets that rock off the well. I don't know if he had any help, I don't think so, and waters the sheep. And then he goes to see the Laban, and spends a month there enjoying good times, enjoying Laban's hospitality. And the thing is to note that, and it's inferred later on, that things start off really well between him and Laban. Laban really likes him as his relative. We're going to have some good times, and it starts with really good times. Now that is going to degenerate as we go along. So Laban has 2 daughters, and Rachel is described, quote, beautiful in form and face. Leah, the older daughter, is simply described as weak eyes, and the Hebrew word there could be taken a number of different ways. It could mean that in function, like she was maybe nearsighted, couldn't see as well, and now he's squinting, or maybe she had eyes that just looked weak, but normally a lot of times it could be translated as soft eyes, feminine eyes. We don't really know for sure, but bottom line is that Jacob loved Rachel. That's another quote. He actually loved Rachel. And then Laban agrees. Of course, keep in mind here, we're going to see that Laban is a master swindler, a conniver. He's even worse than Jacob. Now, Jacob, as you already know, has done a little bit of deception back home. And we're going to see he's going to be doing some genetic manipulation with a herd, even though he didn't know about genetics. He certainly knew about selection. And I think Laban could see that Jacob loves Rachel. And when you see that, you're in a very bad negotiating position if you're Jacob. And Jacob, he's going to swim oceans and climb mountains for this woman. And so Laban agrees to give Rachel to Jacob in marriage. Now, Jacob doesn't have anything except his knapsack, his backpack. And he's probably got not much in the way of money. He probably got a little bit for the travel, but not enough for the bride price, which was the custom back then and even into the first century. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's, let's say, 40-hour week. Now, I grew up on a beef farm. It's not 40 hours a week, I can tell you that. It was more like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's what it normally is. And it would probably be the same here. It's chores on Sunday. But let's say it's just 40, minimum wage, 52 weeks in a year, 7 years. That's over $250,000 in today's buying power. Today's buying power, $250,000, and that's what the bride price was for Rachel. More normal, we can infer that from some stuff said at Mount Sinai, was closer to 5 years' wages, $183,000. But Jacob ends up paying double that because at the end of the 7 years, he goes through the shocking experience of waking up after the wedding in the tent, because it's daylight now, you can see, and he's married Leah, not Rachel. But no problem, Laban works out another deal. He can work another 7 years and get Rachel. See, he ends up working 14 years for this woman. He really must really love Rachel. And that's it. Now, a couple of things here. Observation. Let's talk a bit about the bride price, because it actually is the context for something else that God says about us in the church and how he values us. But this was seen, for sure, today it's seen in our culture as a very demeaning practice, where in our culture, a man pays nothing to marry or to live common law with a woman. Nothing, and makes no lifelong commitment. Well, I'm not talking about Christian marriage here. I'm talking about a lot of stuff that happens in our culture. So there's no real demonstration of value here. In both the Old Testament and New, it was a way for the father to ensure that his daughter was truly valued by the man, and because he had to come up with a means ahead of the marriage, that he had the means to care for her and the work ethic. And also, it was interesting when I started diving into the bride price in ancient Israel, it was also meant that for the average man, he wouldn't be able to acquire another wife for the average guy, because he had paid a lot of money bride price for this woman. And we see later on that this is important to Laban as well. On their parting words, he wanted Jacob to vow he will not take any other wives besides his daughter. Now, Jacob was in a position now to acquire more wives if he had wanted to. But the other thing that most people aren't aware of is it also gave the woman economic protection if she were divorced or widowed. So the father would have that wealth transferred to him. He could use it, of course, and expand his own wealth. But the idea behind that was that he would be able to care for his daughters if they were divorced or widowed. They would come back to him and he would care for them. And we're going to see a hint of that later on when the two women, Rachel and Leah, talk about what their father did with this. But the more the man loved and valued a woman, the more he was willing to pay. Now, I'm not saying we should have a bride price today. Don't get that. I am so thankful for that, actually, because when I proposed, I not only didn't have any money, but I had a student loan, so I was even worse shape. But this was the context here, and there's a point to be made here. And the point to be made is that it is helpful to understand the context when God speaks of his people as his bride or his wife, both in the Old Testament and the New, as a way to help us understand God's love for us and his expectations for husbands like myself, and the highest possible value he's assigned to us as his people. So Jacob was willing to pay substantially more than normal because he loved Rachel. So how much did God pay for us? He laid down his life for us. Greater love has no man than this, that he lays down his life for us. And Christ loved the church. Husbands are to love their wives the same way. gave himself up for her. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Two things here. We see that we wouldn't catch this in our culture, but back in the first century, they really did caught it, because there was this idea that the value that a man had, or the esteem he had for this woman he was about to marry, would be reflected on the bride price. They would understand that, and they would see, wow, God does love us in an unquantifiable way when he lays his own life down for us. But then he calls normal guys like myself who are married, husbands, he calls them to that same standard. And this is back in the first century when Ephesians was written. But moving on, we notice something here. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and the Hebrew word there means kind of like scorned, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So note that we have a God, and this is going to come up, a God who sees what's going on. And Leah has been raised in a household where there are idols. We're going to find that out. And Laban's probably not the best example of a considerate and kind person, as becomes evident. But Leah is, God sees her anyways. God sees that she is scorned by her husband. Now, the interesting thing is what he did for Leah, because she was hated. What he did was he gave her the ability to bear 6 sons and 1 daughter, which would have greatly elevated her status. But at the same time, we're going to see that year after year after year, she was always hoping. I'm sorry. I don't know why I get emotional about this, but I feel bad for her. She was hoping that her husband loved her. And you see that again and again and again. And God never really, he never fixed that problem. He never fixed that problem. But instead he saw and he gave her something else instead. And this is Leah. And we're going to see more stuff about Leah. And so there's the first boys. And one little observation that comes at the end, it was not Leah who stole the household gods. It was Rachel who did it. And you're going to see there's quite a contrast between Leah and Rachel. There's a tendency, and I've had that same tendency over the years. So I heard about this story before I even went to school, when I was a preschooler. And there's a tendency to, Rachel, he really loved Rachel. She's the one that, you're cheering for and everything else. But when you really dive into the passage, it's actually Leah who is the one who seems to love God in a very real way, substantially more in different ways than Rachel. Point. God sees injustices and hardships in this world. He's involved in people's lives in ways we may never even be aware of. Application, be careful. Be careful about speaking against God, because it appears to you he's doing nothing for the poor and persecuted. One quote from James, the Holy Spirit said to the writer James, or spoke through him, "Has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him?" And you will see that Leah, as badly treated as she was, or underloved as she was by her husband, that kept on and on and on, and the casual bystander might say, isn't that too bad? But really, God was working for Leah, and she acknowledges this in her different ways throughout this section in these 3 chapters. So that's chapter 29, just a few observations there. Let's move into Genesis chapter 30 now. I titled it again, Lack of Imagination here, More Children and the Sketchy Business Deal that he makes with his father-in-law Laban. So in desperation, quite a few years have passed, because if we can infer a sequence timeline here, it appears that Leah had 4 sons. So we're talking roughly 4 years there, plus or minus. 4 years, and Rachel hasn't got any. In fact, it turns out that Rachel, over her entire life, only bears 1 son, and then the second one at her death. She dies probably a few minutes or several minutes after childbirth when Benjamin's born. But during the time in Haran, her whole time in Haran, she only has 1 child. And there's 20 years here, 20 years, although she's only ends up being married for 20 minus 7. And I don't have my calculator with me, so I can't tell you what that is. So let's just move on. And my wife always laughs at me because she worked in a store where she always did mental math, and she doesn't need any calculator. I was an engineer. I need a calculator because you better make sure you've got that accurate, that number accurate. So in desperation, Rachel gives her maid to Jacob as a concubine. And the difference between the concubine, first of all, Jacob pays no bride price for this concubine. In fact, that's inferred that that concubine, that maid, belonged to Rachel even before she was married. So when he married Rachel, along came Rachel's maid. But that maid would not, kind of like those children would still belong to Rachel, even though the maid had them as a surrogate mother. So it's kind of like there's things here you wouldn't want to promote. Stuff, there's stuff going on here. Then Leah sees this, and she gives her maid to Jacob to do the same thing, and she has Gad and Asher. And I really have a hard time respecting Jacob here, because I just say, man, what is going on? Doesn't he have? But we always have to be careful on judging people who lived at another time, in another culture, in another era, because if I had been raised in that culture, would I have behaved different? I don't know. I would like to think so, but I am not so naive to think that I'm in a position to pass judgment on these guys down here. Although, again, not to be recommended. None of this stuff going on, but the thing comes to mind here. Does the fact that this mess, and I basically feel, I'll be honest with you, I think this is a mess. What's going on here, that this mess is in the Bible, does that fact mean that God endorses this? Because I've seen this as a person who has worked for decades with university students. If it's in the Bible, this is what God's promoting. And no, not at all. This is an historical narrative, and it's got the unvarnished real life details in here. And from this historical narrative with unvarnished real life details, we can see how God works. And to me, this is also has implications for the historical authenticity of these accounts. There was a temptation. For example, I listened to a whole series on Caesar's wars against the Celts. And he wrote a book about this. Well, actually, he's an extensive account, Julius Caesar, and the narrator, whatever his hardcore history audiobook, highly recommended, it's called The Celtic Holocaust, and what Julius Caesar is just shocking, it's terrible. But he constantly, from time to time, reminds the listener that we're reading something that Julius wrote about himself. So he portrays himself as a hero, always better than what real life was like. That is not happening here. And this is one way you can sort of discern between history written by the victors, so to speak, making themselves look real good, and real history. And what we're seeing here is real history. We're seeing Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, all of those guys, and then later on King David. These people, there's some pretty shocking things said about them, but what I take away from this is God has presided over the writings of his scripture to make sure that this is reality that's being portrayed here, and he's a God who sees the real life, and he keeps people in real life, and these are not necessarily, you're seeing the warts along with the good things. That's what you're seeing. There's good things here, by the way, and we'll see that too. Okay, more boys and concubines. So another passage says, and this is Leah. It says, and God listened to Leah. There's an implication here that even though she's been raised in a home that has household gods, she is appealing to God himself. She's praying. God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. She was praying about the fact that she had stopped bearing children, and she wanted to bear more children because her husband still didn't seem to care for her as she wished he would. She conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah says, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. Remember, Jacob paid no bride price for this servant, as he ought to, as he normally would, as for the bride or the concubine, but this is the context of what she's saying. God has given, this is better than if Jacob had paid me a bride price for my maid. He has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar, and Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah says, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me. Now that's a key phrase there. Now my husband will honor me. There's an implication here, and this is her sixth son. And remember, there's been quite a gap between the first four and these two. Years have gone by now, probably at least 6, plus the gap, 8, 10 years, and she's still wanting her husband to honor her. And so you've got some sympathy here for Leah. And you see, Jacob's not a perfect husband by any stretch of the imagination here either. But they live in a different culture. They don't have a church. There's no such thing as church. They don't even have a Bible. It hasn't been written yet. Maybe the book of Job. Some scholars think that's the oldest one. Maybe it was around, but all he has is what his parents have passed down. But out of Leah comes half the tribes of Israel, including not only the line of kings, including the Messiah, Jesus Christ, but also the priests. All of that comes from her sons. Just something to point out here, but finally, Rachel has 2 sons, and this appears to be after Leah has had 6 sons, and the maids each have had 2 sons, and finally, Rachel has a little boy, names him Joseph. And later on, she will have Benjamin at her death, but that's not in Haran. So for the 20 years in Haran, she only has this one child, Joseph. But she is very happy about that as well. Now, the 6-year livestock deal, let's take a look here at what we can infer from this. Jacob agrees to look after Laban's livestock if he can keep all the striped, spotted, and black sheep and goats. That's the way it starts. So Laban immediately, upon the deal being struck, he says, okay, tells his sons, take all of those out of the herd, which you would think are going to go to Jacob. Nope. He moves those 3 days' journey away from Jacob and puts those in charge of his sons. So Jacob actually starts with 0, nothing. It's going to be next spring when all these normal white ones, or whatever, the non-striped, non-spotted, and non-black ones, when they have their little lambs and their calves, or their lambs and their kids, we're talking goats and sheep here, then he can start collecting some pay. So he starts with absolutely nothing, a nice smooth move on Laban's part. But Jacob, being a little conniver himself, embarks on a selective breeding program for the next 6 years to skew the genetics in his favor. Now, you don't need to know anything about genetics to be able to selectively breed your herd. Dad did that. We had a beef herd, about 120 breeding beef cows, and there was things that Dad did to always enhance the strength, the production of his herd. If a cow had problem calving, out of here. It was always the one, so we almost never had problems for calving, and the size, the amount of beef that those things would put on, always the biggest heifers were chosen, and very great care on the bulls that we would have in breeding our cattle, and so forth. So over the years, Dad developed a really good herd, and maybe he took a biology course, I don't know. But bottom line is, people have known about this for thousands of years. This isn't a new thing, the selective breeding program. But unfortunately, Laban sees that, so if they're all turning out to be striped, he changes the deal and say, I made a mistake, too many striped ones for this deal here. I'll take the striped ones, you can have the spotted ones and this and that. And he changes it 10 times. And this is repeated. So it turns out that it's useless for Jacob to embark on his selective breeding program, because whatever he produces as the dominant trait in that herd, Laban sees that and he helps himself. And this goes on for 6 years. So I think Jacob is in the school, he's under the tutelage of the master swindler. But God is teaching him something, not to rely on his own conniving and his manipulation, whatever else, but rather Jacob, and we're going to see that shortly, relies on God. So, despite all of this, it says, thus the man Jacob increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, camels and donkeys. And that's kind of the way chapter 30 ends, is that things are going really well for Jacob despite all the things that Laban is doing. And it's not easy. In the scripture reading this morning, we saw that Jacob actually, it was not easy. Rain or shine. Animals attack his flock, kill a few, he takes the loss. Year after year, not to mention working 14 years for Rachel, And I think Jacob really, I don't know, we don't really know, but he should have valued Leah much, much more. Okay, Genesis chapter 31. Finally, Jacob's 20-year training and education ends with his departure from Haran, I'm serious. I'm serious when I say Jacob's training and education. God is putting Jacob through a 20-year program here, and he's going to be a different man when he leaves Haran than when he arrived in Haran. So they all, so things are not looking good in his relationship with Laban and his sons. Laban is a generation older than him. He's had another generation to learn how to get things done and manipulate and swindle. Laban's sons are probably roughly the same age as Jacob, because remember, Laban is his mother's brother. So he pulls his wives together and he says, you know that I have served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not, note this, but God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. That's despite this huge stacked deck he's playing against. Not a level playing field in the least. No problem. God sees him. He keeps Jacob. And at the same time he's teaching Jacob it's useless to connive, at the same time he's showing Jacob that he is God, Jacob. He's taking care of him. Then the angel of the Lord, this is Jacob continuing to speak to his wives. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. So this is the official start of the end. God did not permit him to harm me. God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. And then we see that God has seen what Jacob is going. Now, one thing to note here, God did not make it easier for Jacob during that whole 20 years. Because Jacob recounts what it was like during those 20 years. It was awful. He has been swindled. It's subjected that he works hard day and night and so forth. It's been tough, but yet all this wealth has come. Jacob knows this wasn't me. This is clearly God. Now, Leah and Rachel's response is interesting. Quote, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. Note that, he has devoured our money. I'll come back to that in a minute. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. And this is interesting. First of all, remember, if you've ever heard patriarchal society nowadays in university, you'll hear a lot of stuff being said about it, that some of it's true and some of it's false. Here you have an actual glimpse, and what I found is interesting, this is clearly a patriarchal society. What I found is interesting is that Jacob just doesn't, hey, wives, we're moving out, pack your stuff up. But he calls his wives and he has a meeting with them. He's treating them with dignity and respect and as partners. And then his wives reply, they say this, that it says he has devoured our money. So that money, the bride price, which in this case was 7 years' labor, which allowed Laban to accumulate a lot of wealth, is gone. So they're saying, we're going with you, saying with Laban, our father, he's got nothing to take care of us with, or that the wages or the wealth, the money, so to speak, that's gone. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us, referring to Leah, Rachel, Jacob, and the children. And to our children, now then, whatever God has said to you, do. And so they give Jacob the thumbs up. Let's do this. They're with them, they're a team, and they leave. Well thought. God concludes Jacob's 20-year time in Haran by reminding him that he is the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. And I think this is very significant because it bookends Jacob's entire experience in Haran. It began, as you saw last Sunday, with him departing Bethel after that vision of God speaking to him, and I think you probably pointed out some stuff about that conversation, that began with God meeting Jacob at Bethel. It now ends, it's clearly ended by God, he informs him, by reminding Jacob that he is the one that Jacob met at Bethel some 20 years ago, and Jacob made a vow. You'd think if God's going to say something, you just shut up and take that. But Jacob made a vow, if you will do this, then I will do that. And God says, well, I have more than just clothed you and fed you. Look at this wealth. Now you keep your vow. And God is a merciful, gracious God. He's given Jacob 20 years to learn these things. And so now it's time for Jacob to fulfill his vow. In the meantime, Laban gets wind that Jacob has absconded with everything, and it's rightfully Jacob's, but Jacob knows there's going to be a problem here if Laban finds out I'm leaving, and we're going to see Jacob summarize that problem. And so he leaves 3 days ahead of time. Finally, Laban finds out about it. He gathers his kinsmen. Now, you know that's always a bad thing. It's not like just, I'll just go catch up to them and say goodbye. No, this is not catch up and say goodbye. When you gather your kinsmen, all the relatives, they're on their camels, they're armed, they're going to take I'm pretty sure Laban's plan is take everything back, send Jacob packing with just his knapsack, what he came with, and that's Laban's plan probably. So anyways, but the night before he finally meets Jacob, he's pursuing him, God speaks to Laban, and God says, Laban recounts this. He says, it is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father, no, the God of your father, spoke to me last night saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And by that word, that Hebrew word, be careful, it means shomer, that's guard. This is a serious warning. Laban gets the point. God says, guard yourself, that you don't say anything, either good or bad, to Jacob. And this is powerful enough that Laban, man that he is, sketchy ethics and whatever, he's going to listen, because he's got to guard himself about this. And now Laban says, you have gone away because you long greatly for your father's house, but why do you steal my gods? Now I kind of shortened the summary here. He claimed that he was going to, why don't you come, let me know? We would have celebrated with tambourine and dancing and everything else and giving you a great send-off. We're going to see what Jacob thinks of that idea in the next slide. But what to note here is that why did you steal my gods? These gods were important enough. Hebrew word is Elohim here. These gods were important, but they were the little fake ones. And I gotta shake my head, man. If your gods, if the thieves steal your gods, you got to go and rescue your gods from the thieves. Like, what kind of gods are these? Why don't you just forget them and worship the true one? But anyways, Laban's all wrought up about them stealing his gods. And then Jacob replies, so this is again a short version, these 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, now just note this, fear of Isaac, that's kind of like Lord of hosts. It's kind of a title or description of God. It was the one who Isaac feared, as in greatly revered, not was afraid of, but greatly revered. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. That's Jacob's response to this. Yeah, right about the tambourine and partying and dancing, everything, and send me on my way. That would not have happened. This is basically what he's saying here. You would have sent me packing with my knapsack, or else your slave for the rest of my life. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. And note that Jacob here is now not attributing any of this anymore. He's learned his lesson probably a number of years earlier, that this is not due to any of his genetic, selective breeding of the flocks of goats and sheep and everything else. No, he's totally been, he realized that he would have nothing had God not intervened. And so you see, Jacob has graduated from this 20-year school of affliction. He's got a great reward that he's bringing with him, but he's also a different man. He's not trusting in his own methods anymore. God saw my affliction. That's the key phrase there. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So let's close here with the application. How does this apply to us today? So I would sum it up. I'm going to look at three things that apply to us in 2026. Our God is the one who sees and keeps us. Again, let's see how that works out. Application. First of all, we have to be cautious. As you learn if you ever study hermeneutics, how to exegete and interpret and understand what the scriptures are saying, one must be very careful about constructing doctrine from narrative passages. So if you see that Laban is cheating and changes, you don't say, oh, God endorses this, I'm going to cheat and whatever. No, be very careful about constructing doctrine from narrative passages, but Romans 15:4 says, whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might find hope. And one thing you can do in narrative passages is you can very carefully observe what God does in those situations. What does he do? What does he say? How does he respond? What does he think about this? That sort of thing, the interaction between God and people. And when you see God working in the narrative passages, you can infer things from that. And you actually get to watch God work from creation until 400 years before the time of Christ in the Old Testament, roughly, through countless different ways, different cultures, and you get to know God. I would say the Old Testament is very important if you want to know and understand God. The New Testament comes with all the details of the important stuff, the systematic theology, and you get to know God even more there and what price he pays for the bride, for us as his people. But you also learn an enormous amount of God. And this is an urban myth that the God of the Old Testament is a wrathful, angry God, and the God of the New is... You need to read the Old Testament and the New. I like to sweep through that on a regular basis, Genesis to Revelation, constantly since I was 8 years old, just taking notes. God never changes, and you get to see, but the societies do and the cultures do, and you see how he works with them might change because of the different cultures and stuff, but he himself does not change. So with that little warning in mind, or that little kind of caveat, let's see what we can learn and apply in our lives today. So, number one, we observed that God saw Jacob this entire time, these 20 years, including the deceit and manipulation that Jacob performed, as well as how Laban was swindling him, and God let it all unfold while still providing for Jacob. So Jacob's not a perfect person, but God is still, and Jacob is suffering for that. He suffers big time, but yet God is changing him. It's a refining fire to trust God rather than his own strategies. Application. So this comes from Romans 28. It maybe sheds light on Romans 28 a little bit. We know that in all things, including the refining fires of life, and Jacob went through 20 years of some pretty serious refining fires. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In Jacob's case, it was a lot of wealth that he accumulated, but it was also a spiritual revolution that took place in his life. In the New Testament, under the new covenant, the wealth is more spiritual than it is physical. We see that's another whole discussion between the old covenant and the new. But God worked in all these things. Number two, God saw that Leah was hated and intervened by both blessing her greatly and by drawing her to a faith in him, although he did not take away that ongoing years of refining fire of Jacob still loving and sleeping with Rachel more than Leah. And the sleeping, you can infer that because one time Leah hired her husband for some mandrakes so that he would sleep with her, and she got pregnant with another son. But so we see this went on for years, and God never took that affliction away as far as we know. Possibly after the death of Rachel is when Jacob would have then begun to see the true Leah, who really did love God and really did try and serve God, and maybe he needed to repent and how he treated her all those years too. We don't know that for sure though. So, application. The prosperity gospel of health and wealth has skewed things badly, portraying the so-called refining fires of life as a result of lack of faith. So I've had people heavily invested in what we might call the prosperity gospel, tell me I should never be sick. One guy said, you need to be you should be a multimillionaire, and if you're not, you got a sin problem in your life. And I'm thinking, well, I said, what about like Hebrews chapter 11, where God's great people of faith lived in holes in the ground and stuff? And he says, oh, I wasn't aware of that. I'll have to check that out. He says, and I'm sitting there not aware of this. Wow. But God uses the refining fires of life as a result. So in reality, let's go back here. This is the point. In reality, God uses those refining fires to refine us like gold and lead us closer to Him in spiritual maturity. And I in recent years have looked, in fact, just this past year or two, I look back on the different great sorrows that I've experienced in this life, and some of the hard things that I had to face. And I would have to say that every one of them has made me a better person. By better person, I mean more compassionate, more thoughtful, burnt away some of the rougher edges, and more dependent on the Lord. I don't like to say that on the one hand because I don't want to sign myself up for more of those refining fires. But on the other hand, I have to say, I'm 71 now. I look back at all these years and I say every one of those hard things has made me a better person. They're a refining fire like gold, and that's what God desires in this life. This life is not always going to be easy. It was not for Leah, but at the same time, God made up to Leah in other ways. And for us, under the new covenant, most of the reward lies in eternity. Well, most, if you're going to quantify it, infinite versus practically nothing here. There's still, but in this life, there's the wonderful fulfillment of experiencing the presence of God on a daily basis. There's nothing in this world that will compare just to the fulfillment of experiencing the presence of God more and more as you go through life. And that takes refining fires and so forth. Last application, God saw that Leah was hated and that Jacob was being swindled by Laban in both his marriages and his livestock deal with Jacob. And in the midst of all that hardship that Jacob had to endure, God did what we saw. So application, God is our vindicator and our protector. In this world, you may be the victim of injustice and hatred because of the name of Jesus Christ, or just injustice, period, for no justification whatsoever. You may be the victim of this. You may have these things that you have to endure. But don't take vengeance into your own hands. Give it all to the Lord. God will someday expose everything, but in the meantime, the injustices, the things, when injustice happens, it really helps me to see this. Wait a sec. God knew that this was going to happen. He knew that person was going to say that, or he knew they were going to do this and that. And he just let it happen. But delete the word just. He let it happen because if he lets it happen, and remember, this is going to make me, consider it all joy, the James chapter 1, consider it all joy, brethren, when you encounter these various trials, because it's God's way of working in your life. It's God's way of making you become more and more like him, more and more Christ-like, more and more imitators of God, burning away the problems like he did with Jacob with his sort of conniving and swindling, and instead bringing Jacob into a closer walk with him, and Leah with God too. And even Rachel in the end acknowledges that God was the one who heard her prayers when along comes Joseph. And that makes all the difference in the world. This is not just some pointless injustice that has been inflicted on me and there's nothing I can do about it. No. Rather, God is permitting these things to occur in our lives as refining fires, and you will be closer to God in the end as a result of this. Or it will be exposed that maybe your faith there's problems with Jacob. He saw that his conniving just really isn't doing anything, and that has to be made right with the Lord. So let's close in prayer and think about this throughout this week. Father, I thank you for this passage, and I thank you for the people who have gone before us and how we get to see what you did in their lives. Lord, how you how Leah embraced you despite what she was facing. How you, despite what Jacob was going through, you kept him and took care of him, and you brought him through that. And Father, I ask that this week you would help us remember these things. And when bad times happen, or if they do, that you will remind us this is merely refining fire, and we'll come out the other side more pure like gold than we were before. There is a purpose, there is a point to what seems to be so unjust to us. There is a purpose, there is a point, and in the end, you will work all things together for good to those that you have called. We ask these things and thank you. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.